California. Happy Tuesday. It is palpably cold here. I am bundled up, and I can literally see the coldness in the air. Lots of great stuff we're going to talk about today. A little bit of a study on happiness in the world, the Detroit Pistons, and what they should do going forward. And we're going to talk football, including, but first, we're going to start with a quick recap of the day, because there were some notable events that happened yesterday, and that includes, first and foremost, Tua Tagovailoa holding his press conference to declare for the NFL draft, which I'm sure some Bama fans were still holding out hope that maybe Tua would be back, but that was not meant to be. The Oklahoma City Thunder lost to the Philadelphia 76ers in a game that was truly one of the best played basketball games of the season this year. Go read the box score. It was a great game. And the big news, which we're going to talk about here, is that the Dallas Cowboys hired the tractor driver as their head coach, former Super Bowl champion Mike McCarthy. And I happen to agree here that calling Mike McCarthy a Super Bowl champion is now an indictment of his legacy. But you are insulting Mike McCarthy when you call him a Super Bowl champion, because as BJ Rahi said in the article about Rodgers versus McCarthy, that Green Bay should have won 5 championships in a row. That team, when it was constructed after they won their first Super Bowl, he says we should have won 5 championships in a row, because the Super Bowl champion team was the worst of the teams the next 5 years, according to Rahi. And what happened after they won Super Bowl 45, they go 15-1, lose their first playoff game to the Giants, who go on to win the Super Bowl. The next year, Colin Kaepernick has one of the most dominating performances in the history of the playoffs. He went for 200 passing yards and over 100 rushing yards against the Packers, goes on to lose the Super Bowl. Super Bowl, well, the next season, they don't get to the Super Bowl. The next season was the year that they, I forgot what happened that year. It wasn't anything of note. The year after that, they lose to, that year, whatever. A year after that, they lose to Seattle in that crazy, they were up 19-7 in 19-7 in the fourth quarter, and Russell Wilson made that ridiculous comeback, forced overtime, Jermaine Kearse catch, they go to the Super Bowl. And then the final year, the year of Super Bowl 51, they ended up losing to the Falcons in the NFC Championship game by pretty extensive blowout. It was the only time Aaron Rodgers got crushed. So Aaron Rodgers in his career does not fare well in those situations, but it could be an indictment of McCarthy. Now for the Cowboys, they chose a conservative coach. They chose a coach that Jerry Jones gets along well with, and a coach that brings a little bit of pedigree. So ultimately, it's like they're hiring Wade Phillips all over again, but that's okay, because Mike McCarthy at least brings you the Super Bowl. And his job is now going to be tied to the players going forward, not named. Basically, actually, let's correct what I'm going to say. If we're going to do this, his job is tied to one man, and his name is Dakota Prescott. If he can continue to develop Dak and make him look semi-Aaron Rodgers, like semi-Aaron Rodgers-esque, if that's why Jerry hired him, that's just not going to happen. But McCarthy's job is going to be tied to the quarterback, as most of these guys are. And Prescott doesn't have a contract presently. Prescott is technically a free agent, but obviously franchise tag. Jerry wants to get a deal done just so that he doesn't have to deal with the repercussions of this for the rest of time. The Cowboys got to move forward in that direction. So it was a very interesting hire. It came very fast, and the Cowboys locked up their man for the long term in Mike McCarthy, who again looks like he should be driving a tractor to games.
So I was reading about an interesting concept, and we're going to diverge from the world of sports for a minute here. I was reading a very interesting concept about the happiness plateau. And what the happiness plateau basically is something that a bunch of scholars and researchers who studied happiness, they discovered that, or basically, and this may seem intuitive to you, that happiness curves at a certain point, and they actually discovered that that point is about $75,000 a year. So a family who makes an income of $75,000 a year, at that point, happiness tends to plateau. In essence, let's take a look at a couple certainties, basically, things that would be obvious. It's hard to be happy when you don't have money, because an inability to financial instability leads to added stress, which leads to more pressures, and the external pressures affect your mind, and life is simply, it becomes more difficult, and it affects your decision making, and you will ultimately, life is harder when you have financial struggles or instability. Obviously, that's not a new concept. But what's also a true fact is that the more money that you have, the easier, not the easier life will be, because as your financial being increases, the less stress you will have, thus you will be happier. It's where people say, this is basically a common misnomer, that people say money can't buy happiness. Well, money can buy happiness to a certain degree. It's like saying that people who win the lottery have the highest suicide rates in, I believe, almost all, the highest percentage of suicide rates of any other like profession, I guess. Winning the lottery is not a profession, but of any kind of group of people. And they also tend to have issues with losing their money faster. So these researchers tackled the question. They're studying happiness, and money can buy you happiness because money relieves you of stress. When people say money can't buy happiness, if they distinct that they're talking about at a certain point, then they would be correct. So basically what these researchers showed, and you can envision it like a line graph, it's just as your money increases, your happiness increases. And they discovered that until about the $75,000 threshold, that's when the straight line starts to curve, and it plateaus to about to basically zero, to where it's not making any kind of impact in terms of your happiness and or how easy or difficult it is to parent. I want to read the quote specifically right now. These are not my own words. So, the scholars who research suggest that more money stops making people happier around $75,000 a year. After that, what economists call diminishing marginal returns set in. If your family makes $75,000 a year and your neighbor makes $100,000 a year, that extra $25,000 a year means that your neighbor can drive a nicer car and go out and eat slightly more often, but it doesn't make your neighbor happier than you or better equipped to do the thousands of small and large things that make for being for being a human being, successful being, or in terms of parenting. So that's the idea behind that plateau. And I theorized after hearing that depending on your levels of jealousy and envy, whatever, you will actually start to feel worse about yourself as you start to add more money, and that the impact will start to diminish. Simply put, because the more money you start to have, the more, depending on what kind of person you are, the more you may start to look around and observe the world, observe what people what you see from other people, like, well, they have this, but maybe I should be that, or else I'm not living up to something. And that's a classic case of people who are wealthy, or especially people of second generation wealth, who are constantly, they work, but they're constantly seeking that kind of approval from society from, hey, that person has something better than me. What am I doing wrong? And that's the wrong mindset to go about, because ultimately that's when the plateau goes from 0 to, at a certain point, it starts to diminish. And I theorized this and then continued reading, and it discussed parenting and how easy or difficult it is. And actually on the parenting graph, it's the same kind of thing where it's going up, 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 and then it plateaus at about $75,000 a year. And then from there on, it starts to decrease. It actually becomes harder to parent when you are very wealthy, because when you try to teach your children the lessons about money and responsibility and things of such, it's much more difficult to do that when the kid looks around and sees all these things that you have and all these advantages and material possessions around them, and they say that it's hard to teach these lessons when everything is provided to them and everything they have, they can see that, and they're not stupid. They're not just going to blindly believe whatever a parent tells them, except sometimes they do, but that's another conversation about overprotecting your child and overprotective parenting in general. But regardless, when they look around and see that, it actually makes it harder for parents to control and breed successful children, raise successful children, to a point where if you have so much money that it actually becomes just as difficult to raise a child at a certain dollar amount, the extremely wealthy, as it is to the extremely poor. And it seems something so simple, yet we don't realize it because we're not looking for the answer to that question. You would think that, as most things are in life, too much of something is bad, too little of something is also bad. If you have too little of something you need, it's bad. If it's too much of something you need, it's also bad. That's something that's normal, yet, or that makes sense, obviously, with anything, but you always are striving to find a happy medium. And that is where this comes into question. And if you apply it to this, and you can apply it to things like money or alcohol or anything else, if you're talking about food, if you're talking about clothing, if you're talking about material possessions, if you're talking about pens. I'm looking at my desk now. If you have 16 pens in your backpack, what is the point of that? And I know pens are not a huge economic impulse, like it's not costing you a lot of money, but it's money that you could be saving. If it works with pens, why wouldn't the same science work with cars or something that's a larger investment, houses, things of such, bathrooms? I know people that have like 4 people living in their house and 6 bathrooms, or you see it all the time. I don't personally know people like that, but you see it all the time. And if it works that simply with everything else, if it works with this, why wouldn't you apply the theory of the happy medium to everything that you do in society, in your life? Because it's hard. But sometimes doing the hard thing is what's important to go forward.